From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Meharry and I work at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress's Office of Scholarly Programs, and I welcome you all today to one of a series of lectures that the Kluge Center sponsors. Today's talk is by Dr. Peter Kalani, and it's entitled Modernism, African Literature, and the CIA. And I want to remind you, as usual, to turn off your cell phones. Tell you that there will be questions at the end, and if you have any questions, you're asking them will be understood as permission for us to broadcast them via a live feed over the library's website. Obviously, I also want to thank the John W. Kluge family for its support of the Kluge Fellowships and the Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. Remember to go to the library's website and sign up for our RSS feeds. And if you're looking for brochures that explain more about the Kluge Center, they're right up front here. And we have plenty more of those. If we run out, we'll run down the hall and get more for you. Dr. Peter Kalani is an associate professor of English at the University of Kentucky, where he teaches 20th century British and post-colonial literature. His first book, Cities of Affluence and Anger, A Literary Geography of Modern Englishness, was published in 2007 by the University of Virginia Press. His next book will be out later this summer and is entitled Commonwealth of Letters, British Literary Culture and the Emergence of a Post-Colonial Aesthetic. And it will be published by Oxford University Press as part of the Modernist Literature and Culture series. Now, today's presentation draws on work that he's doing for his next project concerning the Cold War era and decolonization. He's done most of the work for this here at the library over the last year, and we're very eager to hear what has come from the research that he's been doing here. During the Cold War era, particularly during the 1960s, the CIA was very active in funding African writers. Now, why would the CIA be particularly interested in the emerging literature of Africa? And why would a fiercely independent cohort of African writers be interested in receiving that funding? If you help me welcome Dr. Peter Kalani, I think we will learn at least some of the answers to those questions.
Okay, I want to thank Mary Lou and Carolyn and Travis and all the other people at the Kluge Center and of course the Kluge family that's helped fund the center. It's been a really great home for me this year, and I really appreciate not only the staff but the other scholars who have been there. I've had some really interesting conversations with some of my colleagues there, and it's I've learned a lot, and I've also thought in new ways about some of my own research. So the title of the talk today is Modernism, African Literature, and the CIA, with this question mark. It's sort of an odd triumvirate. And hopefully I'll raise a few questions even if I don't provide that many answers. It's not widely discussed, even among scholars of African literature, that the CIA was the most active and influential patron of Anglophone African writing during the 1960s. Through its European affiliate, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA dispersed funds to many of Africa's emerging cultural institutions, although the real source of the funding was hidden from the recipients, and that's important to keep in mind. The first major international symposium on African literature, the Conference of African Writers of English Expression at Kampala's Meharry University in 1962, was sponsored by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The CIA supplied programming for African radio with the Transcription Center, a London-based recording studio and clearinghouse for African cultural materials. Black Orpheus, the Nigerian Arts Review, and Transition, the slick cultural magazine started in Uganda, were both supported by CIA subventions. The Mbari Club in Nigeria, the Kemkemi Arts Center in Kenya were also beneficiaries of CIA interest in African art and literature. By sponsoring these organizations, the CIA monies reached nearly all the Anglophone African intellectuals of the day. Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, Ezekiel, or now Ezekiel Mephala, Christopher Okigbo, John Pepper Clark, and many others. Now, why would the CIA divert resources to support a whole generation of African intellectuals, many of whom were staunch critics of the United States and its allies? Scholars may never be able to answer that question definitively, the CIA being what it is. But their cultural patronage in Africa was part of a much larger scheme to court intellectuals the world over. As a number of historians and journalists have documented, the CIA used the Congress for Cultural Freedom, headquartered in Paris, to fund an enormously wide range of cultural institutions on every continent. African writers and intellectuals were merely one part of a vast global conspiracy, and an extremely important part of Cold War maneuvering, as I shall argue in this presentation. Winning the favor of African intellectuals was deemed of vital significance in the geopolitical context of decolonization and the Cold War. US intelligence officers were fearful that decolonizing nations would drift toward the Soviet Union, and they believed that covert support for intellectuals in those regions might help limit communist influence. Surprisingly, CIA support for the arts came with relatively few strings attached, partly because the operation was covert and the money routed through various front organizations, partly because African intellectuals adamantly refused to have their political opinions dictated to them. Protecting the secrecy of the program often took priority over directing the political tenor of CIA-funded programs. As a result, the Congress for Cultural Freedom tended to sidestep political confrontations out of concern that they would alienate the very people they hoped to influence, or worse yet, that the cover would be blown on the program. At most, CIA hierarchy tried to be very selective about the type of intellectual it would bring into the fold, although it managed to support a number of writers who could be quite critical of the United States and its allies. So before talking in more detail about the types of projects that benefited from CIA support, I thought I'd introduce you to some of the key personalities and say a few words about some of the conferences and magazines that were affected by this program. Tom Braden, he's born in 1918 in Iowa. He enlists in the British Army for the Second World War before the US had entered the conflict. Allen Dulles in the late 1940s starts to recruit him to be one of his deputies at the CIA when it was founded. Braden is a self-described intellectual who was much more interested in the ideas being debated in the Cold War than in assassinations or even in gathering intelligence. And he led the psychological warfare initiatives in the early 1950s at the CIA. He left the CIA, at least officially and formally, in 1954. Now, in 1967, the cover for this Congress of Cultural Freedom, or Congress for Cultural Freedom, was blown, and he was working as a journalist at the time, and he wrote an article that went a long way to disclosing some of the aspects of this program, and it was called, "I'm Glad the CIA is Immoral," in scare quotes, and that was published in the Saturday Evening Post on 20th of May, 1967. He's a very colorful character. He's probably best known for writing an autobiography called 8 is Enough about his family of 8 children, and it was turned into a somewhat successful television series in the 1970s. He also, and this picture comes from it, he went on to become a TV pundit. He was the brainchild of CNN's Crossfire, and he was the guy on the left. And Pat Buchanan, for a long time, was his sparring partner on the right. And this is an important thing to note. A lot of these CIA characters saw themselves as politically left of center, for whatever that's worth. Rabidly anti-communist, but also rabidly anti-McCarthyite. They thought they could win the Cold War by having better ideas, not by suppressing free speech. This is a great sort of CIA power lunch, supposedly from where this photograph was taken. The guy in the center of it is Michael Jocelyn. He's born in Estonia in 1908. He was in Berlin in the 1920s. He came to the U.S. in 1936. He served during World War II in the U.S. military's psychological warfare division. And immediately at the end of the war, he became very active in intelligence services. He was known as a fixer, which means he could get anything done. If you wanted, bootleg liquor for a party, he was the guy to get it for you. If you wanted a passport fixed or to move somebody quietly from one zone to another, he was the guy to do it. He spoke 4 languages fluently, and he was very, very cultured. He was very interested in some of the literary figures that he worked with in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He was the CIA's direct link at the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The guy in the right front is Melvin Lasky. He was born in the Bronx in 1920. He served in World War II as the official combat historian for the U.S. 7th Army in France and Germany. In 1948, he starts an anti-communist magazine in Berlin called Der Monat, and that's during the blockade of Berlin. Very involved. He went on to work for Encounter magazine, which I'll talk about in a minute. He also made, in the early 1960s, an important reconnaissance trip throughout English-speaking Africa. And he was one of the guys who's involved in this program who says, hey, we need to get more involved in Africa, which we'll talk about in just a moment. This is a picture from the first meeting in Germany in 1950 of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, okay? And this is how the CIA developed its cultural diplomacy programs. As I said, it was born in Berlin in 1950. It was revealed as a CIA front in 1967. So those are the main years of operation, 1950 to 1967. And what the Congress for Cultural Freedom did is they supported cultural programming of their own, but they also dispersed a lot of money to various cultural organizations, some of which I'll talk about in a moment. It's a CIA front. Now, the CIA got their money to the Congress for Cultural Freedom by establishing front organizations or dummy foundations. So the main one was called the Farfield Foundation. And this was a pure fabrication of the CIA. The CIA would give Farfield money. Farfield would give it to the Congress of Cultural Freedom. The Congress of Cultural Freedom would spend some of it and then give some of it to other organizations. CIA, interestingly enough, also routed some of their money through very legitimate foundations like the Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller foundations, right? These are some of the wealthiest and most prestigious foundations in the US. And the CIA used them to get money to places it wanted to go. The Congress for Cultural Freedom never hid the fact that it was anti-Soviet, but it always insisted that the money came from non-governmental sources because it was thought that the Congress for Cultural Freedom would be more effective if the people involved with it weren't paid stooges, right? This was one of the main complaints with the Soviet cultural diplomacy machine, is that if you accept money for the Soviets, you've got to buy their line. And so the CIA thinking was, we've got to make this patronage covert because it's important that the intellectuals who are involved seem as if they're speaking of their own free will. Very important part of the covert operations in the program. Encounter magazine, it's launched in 1953. It's probably the preeminent Anglo-American magazine during this time. It had a blend of high modernist art, so there were poems by Edith Sitwell and extracts from Virginia Woolf's diary and extracts from W.B. Yeats's letters. But it also had long op-ed pieces and coverage of current events. Stephen Spender, a well-known poet, British, from the Auden generation, he was one of the first editors of Encounter, along with Irving Kristol, who I'm not going to talk about much today, but he's an important intellectual in the U.S. in the period from about 1950 to 1970. So Stephen Spender, I mention him because he was one of the people involved with the Congress for Cultural Freedom who was very active in recruiting African intellectuals and convincing them to become part of this Congress for Cultural Freedom network. He had a reasonably close relationship with Wole Soyinka and some of the other characters that I'll discuss today. Ezekiel, as he was known, later Ezekiel Mephala, he's a South African expatriate. In 1959, he publishes Down Second Avenue, an autobiographical book with Faber and Faber, a very well-known British publisher. It's T.S. Eliot's publisher. And this establishes him as one of the preeminent English language African intellectuals of the period. He's recruited to be the Congress for Cultural Freedom's Africa chief in the early 1960s. And he is the person who comes up with the idea for the African Writers Conference in 1962. Okay, he probably didn't know, for what it's worth, about CIA funding. Stephen Spender, he probably didn't know either. There's only a very few people who actually knew about CIA funding. Okay. Some of you who are familiar with African literature may have heard of this, the 1962 African Writers of English Expression Conference. This is by far and away the biggest international conference. It's really the first conference of African writing in English, and anybody that you're likely to have heard of from that early 1960s generation was there. Chinua Achebe, Wole Soyinka, Mfalele himself was there, Christopher Akigbo, who I'm going to talk about a little bit, Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Rajat Nyoji, who's the editor of Transition Magazine, which I'll also talk a little bit. The Congress is pretty well known because Ngugi wa Thiong'o is carrying the manuscript of his first novel, Weep Not Child, in his suitcase, and he shows up after the conference proceedings at Achebe's door, and he says, "Here, read this." Achebe reads it on the spot and offers him a contract, and that's how Ngugi becomes part of the African Writers series in the early 1960s. Black Orpheus magazine. It's launched in 1957 by a German expatriate working in Nigeria. His name's Uli Bayer. It's important to note that in 1957, when the magazine is launched, it's launched on a shoestring budget and there's no CIA funding involved. The CIA approaches Bayer in 1960 and says, "Hey, we like your magazine. We want to give you some money." Bayer says, "Okay, sounds like a good idea. What do I have to do?" They say, "Nothing. Keep doing what you're doing. We like your magazine." It's important to note that Black Orpheus was totally apolitical. And it's a point to which I'll return in a little while. Transition magazine. This is a picture taken from the cover of Transition after its revival by Henry Louis Gates in the early 1990s, but it starts out in 1961 on Rajat Nyoji's porch. And this is Rajat Nyoji. He's Ugandan of Indian family, Indian origin. He's a very interesting guy. He's imprisoned by Obote in 1968, and after a period in detention, comes out, leaves Uganda, ends up in the United States, gives up the editorship of Transition, and most people say he never really recovered from that experience in prison. It's very much Transition, a modernist little magazine, along the lines of Encounter. There's lots of original poetry, which I'll talk about a little bit today, but there's also current affairs and coverage of political events. Before I move on to talk about Wolé Soyinka, it's important to remember that Transition magazine is also not funded by CIA at the inception or the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's only about a year and a half after the start of the magazine that the Congress for Cultural Freedom approaches Nyoji and says the same thing they said to Bayer. Hey, we like your magazine. We want to give you some money. Wolé Soyinka, he's the first African Nobel laureate in literature in 1986. He broke onto the scene in 1960 when he won a playwriting competition, and as a result of that, his play, A Dance of the Forest, was staged at the official Nigerian independence celebrations in 1960. That playwriting competition was run by Encounter magazine and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. When Soyinka goes to jail later on in the 1960s during the Nigerian Civil War, it's the Congress for Cultural Freedom that helps pay for his lawyers and leads the international outcry to try to get him released from jail. Last guy I'll mention here briefly, Christopher Okigbo, a Nigerian poet, often talked about as the most promising poet of his generation. He's on the left. You can see he was quite friendly with Achebe, who's pictured there in the middle. He is a poet who writes very much in the high modernist mode, which I'll talk about a little bit more as I continue. So those are some of the personalities and some of the institutions. Now, one of the most surprising things about the cultural organizations that the CIA funded through the Congress for Cultural Freedom is that they tended to be thoroughly non-political. In the few instances when these organizations started to address political questions, as in the case of Transition, they took a stance of Cold War neutrality, arguing that newly independent African nations needed to be able to choose their own direction, free from interference from the US or the Soviets. When I first learned that the CIA had funded a number of artistic centers and literary magazines and writers' conferences in 1960s Africa, I assumed that this was part of some subtle effort to turn African intellectuals into apologists for US foreign policy. However, my archival research revealed that this was not at all the case. Even if the CIA had originally intended to operate this way, a number of factors prevented them from doing so. First, of course, was the importance of preserving the secrecy of the program, and this took priority over all other considerations. Any effort to pressure intellectuals into taking a stance on Cold War issues would threaten to blow the cover of the operation. So the secrecy of CIA funding was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed the CIA to support writers who would never have agreed to accept CIA funding. On the other hand, the secrecy of the program severely limited the sort of influence that the CIA could possibly hope to exert. The other major factor that limited the CIA's political maneuvering was the skepticism and fierce independence of African intellectuals themselves. And this resonates with images that we have of Soyinka. Nobody is going to tell him what to do. CIA and nobody else. When African writers first heard that the funds supporting some of their organizations came from US foundations, they immediately asked if the CIA or some other governmental agency was behind the money. Of course, they were told no, and to prove it, their patrons gave them great latitude. In order to placate the intellectuals they hoped would accept their support, the CIA had to be extremely cautious about the sort of political demands it could place upon the people who were recipients of its funding. The result, as I will suggest in the remainder of my time, was very interesting. Rather than sponsoring cultural institutions that adopted a clear Cold War stance, the CIA funded organizations that were neutral and largely silent about political matters pertaining to the Cold War. The African cultural institutions funded by the CIA in the early 1960s usually operated on the art for art's sake model, keeping politics out of their operations. My working premise today is that the art for art's sake line, which is largely the doctrine of European modernism in the first half of the 20th century, provided a sort of common ground upon which African intellectuals and their CIA backers could agree to suspend their political differences. The philosophy of art for art's sake, or aesthetic autonomy, as it is sometimes called, was manifested in different ways during the European modernist period, roughly the first half of the 20th century. In music, we have the evolution of atonal symphonies by composers such as Schoenberg, Stravinsky, and Prokofiev, who were freeing music from the need to conform to conventions of harmony. In the visual arts, you have a variety of sculptors and painters who are challenging the idea that art had to be representational, thereby freeing the visual arts from the need to represent objects from the physical world. In literature, modernism made it fashionable to write without having words necessarily tied to literal or worldly meanings. Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, Wallace Stevens are all well known for producing this type of literature, in which language could be freed from referring to something external or outside of itself. I will suggest that these aesthetic conventions were both used and transformed in the context of 1960s African literature. In particular, the idea that true art could not be bought, and that the artist needed to remain aloof from the world of politics and commerce, found a new lease on life during decolonization in the 1960s. In this version of modernism, the artist could be free to express him or herself by remaining independent of political or commercial interests. Now, I should add in passing that modernism is largely by default the aesthetic credo on the Western side of the Iron Curtain. Now, the reasons for this are complex, but it certainly wasn't because all Cold Warriors were admirers of T.S. Eliot or Igor Stravinsky or James Joyce, right? What happened is that the Soviets start condemning modernism as bourgeois and decadent. And if the Soviets condemn it, well, the US had better say, well, no, we defend these people and their right to free expression. So on the Western side of the Iron Curtain during the 1950s, modernism becomes a convenient symbol in the cultural world for aesthetic freedoms. Finally, I'd like to suggest that modernist aesthetic ideas, especially the art for art's sake model, were appealing to intellectuals in the decolonizing world because they were Cold War neutrals, unwilling to support either the US or the Soviets. A supposedly apolitical version of modernism was attractive to young African writers because it allowed them to style themselves as disinterested or as objective intellectuals who were not bought off by either side in the Cold War. So in the story that I'm telling here, the image that modernism sometimes like to project about itself, that the arts are autonomous, free from external considerations like commerce and politics, this aesthetic philosophy was almost tailor-made for intellectuals from non-aligned regions in the Cold War who like to affirm their independence and their neutrality in the Cold War. The logic of the non-aligned movement, when translated into aesthetic form, could be expressed, roughly speaking, as modernism. Three of the Congress for Cultural Freedom's favorites in Africa, Christopher Okigbo, Wole Soyinka, and Rajat Nyoji, all fit this basic profile. They were Cold War neutrals, anti-totalitarian in their politics, and very much admirers of high modernist European literature. It's a very curious combination born out of the strangeness, the convoluted logic of the Cold War. So now I want to turn to some of these programs that the Congress for Cultural Freedom funded in Africa. So first, the Meharry Conference in 1962. One of the reasons the conference is well known is that it deepened the divide between English language and French language African writers. Wole Soyinka, Christopher Akigbo, and other Anglophone writers were parodying negritude at the conference and saying, look at this farcical idea that all these French language writers have come up. That's one of the reasons why the conference is well known. One of the other reasons the conference is well known is it was the place where the whole language debate in African literature started. So is English just an imperialist language, or is it something that African writers can use to reach an intercontinental, even international audience? Now, because these language debates were so polemical, much of the content of the conference has been relegated to the long-forgotten footnotes of intellectual history. The transcripts of the conference show a strong preference for detachment, irony, and universality, somewhat surprisingly, as these standards worth developing in the literature of an independent Africa. To put it another way, the conference presenters argued that racial consciousness and political militancy are not appropriate literary messages. People have long forgotten that this is the way the conference proceeded. Two of the keynote speakers, Saunders Redding and Arthur Drayton, presented on African American and Caribbean literature, both arguing that black writers from the Americas offered Africans good literary models because they did not confine themselves to racial themes. Saunders took James Baldwin, surprisingly, as his example, insisting that Baldwin goes beyond representations of racial conflict to present universalist messages. And this is a highly debatable interpretation of Baldwin as a universalist writer. But it's an interesting representation of him. Other presenters insisted that the best young African writers were already creating literature that transcends racial categories. And I'll quote from one discussion of the poetry from the Nigerian poet John Pepper Clark. And this is from the conference proceedings. Quote, "Here, in his poetry, is no gesture of political or historical protest, no advice, no statement even of the poet's color or its significance, but a faithful and beautifully controlled account of individual experience." End quote. Now, given that the conference took place at the height of the decolonization moment, and I should also add the height of the civil rights movement, really, in the United States, when politics were all important in sub-Saharan Africa, the conference's aesthetic standards seem like a protest, insisting that the best literature avoid excessive racial consciousness, instead striving for some kind of universalist messages. The presence of Christopher Akigbo, the flamboyant Nigerian poet, certainly added to the impression that the conference organizers had a deep attachment to modernist aesthetics. In one memorable moment during the conference, Akigbo pronounced, "I don't read my poetry to non-poets." He did consent, however, to share some of his verse with the Meharry delegates. And here's a short lyric poem that we think Akigbo read to the audience, and this is on the handout that went around. "Suddenly becoming talkative like weaver birds summoned at offside of dream remembered between sleep and waking, I hang up my eggshells to you of Palm Grove, upon whose bamboo towers hang, drip with Yestrop wine, a tiger mask and nude spear. Queen of the damp half-light, I have had my cleansing, emigrant with airborne nose, the he-goat on heat," end quote. So written in the early 1960s, published in African little magazines, recited at the most important meeting of Anglophone African writers. Given the context, it's difficult to imagine poetry more conspicuously and self-consciously modernist in idiom. It's a sonnet, I guess, and the meaning is at best obscure. This sort of poetry, deliberately difficult and willfully apolitical, was designed to provoke his audience, and Akigbo certainly had his detractors among his peers. And I'm also tempted to say that Okigbo is here engaged in a kind of playful game of one-upmanship with some of the other people of the conference. They're saying, hey, we need your poetry to be non-racial, non-political, universal. And he says here, I am taking the idea of detachment to a whole new level. The poet seems to liberate poetic language from the drudgery of prosaic meaning. Now, from the evidence, the Congress for Cultural Freedom were well satisfied with the conference and its proceedings. The meeting was discussed at great length throughout the network's affiliates, especially in Transition magazine. There were certainly no concerns that the content of the discussions had been insufficiently political. Now I want to turn for a few moments to talk about Black Orpheus and Transition magazines. I'll get to this in a moment. This is on the flip side of your handout. As I mentioned, Black Orpheus is founded in 1957 by a German expatriate, Uli Bayer, with a grant from the Ministry of Education in Nigeria's western region. It was only in 1960, as Jocelyn and Spender were hoping to expand the Congress for Cultural Freedom's African base, that Bayer and the magazine joined the network. One of the most notable features of Black Orpheus was that it was a Black Atlantic journal operating during the height of the civil rights movement and decolonization, and yet it was fastidiously apolitical, as I've already mentioned. Wole Soyinka later described it, quote, Black Orpheus was literally non-political. It published poetry and plays, it reproduced artworks, the plastic arts, reported on performance arts. Its mission was to link the diaspora culturally with Africa without getting involved in politics, end quote. For the editors, this was partly a pragmatic decision. Avoiding politics in a divided, ethnically diverse, and rapidly changing West Africa allowed the journal to attract contributors and readers of all stripes from across the Black diaspora. Finding contributors and readers from across the diaspora was facilitated by sidestepping political differences and focusing exclusively on art. Now, Nyoji's magazine, Transition, was self-consciously modernist in a way that Black Orpheus was not. The title, as some of you may know, alludes to one of the legendary European little magazines of the interwar period. Nyoji's first literary contribution to the magazine, 71 equals 70 ton, appears near the beginning of the first issue. It's a short prose poem offering a condensed view of the type of literary ambitions Nyoji was then nursing. Quote, myriad existences forgotten, begins the piece, seemingly in mid-sentence. And this is the back of your handout. Over a tense past and a vocabulary future full of new cooked meanings, meaning, but nothing else, end quote. And it goes on from there. It's sometimes hard to read it without parodying it, but we can leave that for another time, I suppose. Now, the sputtering repetition of meaning in this opening line might make the knowing reader think of a Wallace Stevens poem or a Gertrude Stein piece, right? A rose is a rose is a rose, or something like that. Meaning here is self-identical. Any attempt to attach external reference to this vocabulary future would be futile. This sort of tautological wordplay represents an attempt to proclaim the autonomy of poetic language, that poetry can be released from the burden of meaning anything prosaic or literal. But such assertions of autonomy, I would argue, are heavily contextual. From this perspective, we might gloss Nyoji's lack of meaning as a direct reference to the tradition of modernist wordplay in its proper performance space, the little magazine. A few issues later, an article by Robbie Macaulay on literary periodicals claims that the little magazine, once the lifeblood of Euro-American modernist culture, was evolving and maturing in exciting new ways in decolonizing regions. Macaulay, who incidentally was a CIA officer, was editor of the Kenyan Review, the only sort of modernist, or one of the only modernist little magazines still operating in the US in the 1950s. And he was also a participant at Meharry. The CIA flew him out there to participate in the Meharry Conference. So he writes this article in Transition that says, magazines like Transitions are the place where modernism is still thriving. And on the evidence of Nyoji's literary stuff, that would seem to be a valid claim. For Neogi and Macaulay, the modernist magazine was the natural home of free expression. The liabilities of the little magazine, insecure funding, erratic publication schedules and distribution channels, and editorial sloppiness, which all plagued transition in its early years, were more than offset by the strengths of the little magazine, namely its supposed independence from vested interests, making it exceptionally nimble and quick to recognize new talents, allowing Neogi to take substantial risks that more established publications could not afford. So here there's a strong association between the sort of little review, the little magazine that flourished during the modernist period, and the idea that, hey, we're intellectuals who are not bought off. We're not mouthpieces for any kind of vested interest, Cold War interests or otherwise. In writing about little magazines in Africa, the literary critic Eric Bolson says that Transition and Black Orpheus offer, quote, an alternative model of the global literary field, one that is not confined to the movement of minor literatures through Western-based capitals. Now, I think there's some evidence to support this claim, although CIA sponsorship of Transition and Black Orpheus encourages me to shy away from the conclusion that these magazines reached a global audience without the support or approbation of centers in the US or Western Europe. But neither do I find compelling the idea that the CIA was squarely in control of these far-flung projects, as the conspiracy theorists are wont to infer. The covert nature of the sponsorship made it almost impossible to dictate a party line, even if the CIA had wanted to do so. Rather, I think it's more plausible to suggest that Transition was able to reach or create a global audience because of external funding without then insisting that this patronage turn Transition into a mouthpiece for US propaganda. If there was a party line, it was drawn around aesthetic rather than ideological convictions. For a brief while, at least, the Congress for Cultural Freedom supported a number of periodicals in the modernist pattern, which was appealing to Africans precisely because it seemed to affirm the autonomy and to secure the neutrality of intellectual work. The form of the little modernist magazine, its willingness to experiment, its presumption of a like-minded audience, and even its haphazardness created the impression that Transition was a space free from orthodoxies and vested interests of any kind. So in my last couple of minutes, I'm going to try to draw a few conclusions from this. Beyond the mere scandal of CIA funding, which is always sort of interesting to read about, especially when it's supporting these, writers. God, where's the CIA funding now? Anyway, first, it's worth pointing out how interwar modernism, especially the idea of aesthetic autonomy, was requisitioned by African writers and inflected rather strongly by ideals of impartiality and detachment. Whatever modernism may have been in the 1920s, by the 1950s, non-communist intellectuals were prone to represent modernism as an aesthetic philosophy of critical disinterest and freedom from orthodoxy. The Cold War context helps explain why African intellectuals such as Neogi, Okigbo, and Soyinka would enthusiastically attach themselves to the legacy of modernism, especially to the form of the little magazine, and also how modernism would become attached to and dependent upon the health of literary culture in the decolonizing world. Second, I'm here offering a revisionist account of post-colonial African writing, which has been so frequently read for its anti-colonial messages and for its various political engagements. Instead, I'd like to suggest that in the early 1960s at least, aesthetic autonomy and apolitical writing were perhaps the most widely accepted literary models among young African intellectuals. Modernism's evolution in the middle decades of the century, during which time it became the dominant 20th century artistic movement taught in universities and conserved in museums globally. was affected by its use in cultural diplomacy programs during the Cold War. So the ability of modernism to seem as if it's autonomous and not paid by vested interests was, I want to suggest, crucially informed by this moment in the Cold War, when modernism may have become something that it wasn't necessarily in the 1920s. It's rewriting literary and cultural history of modernism from a Cold War perspective. Finally, it's evident that the revelation of CIA funding in 1967 carved out yet another of modernism's gravestones, providing a handy commemorative date for literary historians such as myself. Modernist literature has been declared dead many times and in many places, and I'm not here to lay modernism to rest once and for all in late 1960s sub-Saharan Africa. In Anglophone Africa, however, CIA funding of cultural institutions left a gap that would not be filled for several generations. The void was institutional. As money dried up, magazines and publishing houses went bust, and lavish international conferences became a thing of the past. But there was also a kind of aesthetic void. The damage caused by covertly funding writers who believed passionately in aesthetic autonomy was lasting, making the principles of detachment, disinterest, and impartiality seem like indefensible positions for African intellectuals in the 1970s. In the process, it also substantially widened the ideological distance between metropolitan and post-colonial intellectuals, a distance that seemed unbridgeable for several decades. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, if you're willing.
I would be happy to field some questions if anybody has any. Yes?
Why was the CIA program in Africa exclusively toward Anglophone Africa?
It's a good, I think they felt, there were a couple things going on. The feeling in the CIA or some of the cultural officers that weren't necessarily working directly for the CIA, but were working for the Congress for Cultural Freedom, felt that the Présence Africaine crowd and the group associated with Senegal and its affiliates were in too strong a position in the Francophone world. They also felt that they were too closely aligned with the Soviet position, which may not be accurate. It seems clear to me from reading Présence Africaine that they were as decidedly neutral in their Cold War politics as the folks in the Anglophone region. But that at least was the impression for the Congress for Cultural Freedom perspective. The Congress for Cultural Freedom also thought that they had a good wedge in the Anglophone regions. Namely, they exploited feelings of antagonism toward the outgoing British to create a kind of Anglophone or English language global intellectual community. They were very concerned that the Anglophone intellectuals like Soyinka be tapped into a global community of English speakers. And they thought they had a real vested interest, therefore, in promoting the use of the English language for intellectual endeavors in the continent. So those are two sort of preliminary reasons for why they targeted Anglophone regions especially. And I should point out that they were well positioned in other respects to exploit the Francophone connections. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was headquartered in Paris. A lot of its programs are happening in French and German. It wasn't exclusively a language question that prevented them from becoming more involved in Africa. It was largely the dominance of the Présence Africaine collective that dissuaded them from doing so. Yes?
Was this an all-male world, both the CIA side and the African writing side?
It was a very, very heavily male world. There were a few African women writers that were involved, but very few. There was a playwright, Efwa Sutherland, in Ghana, who was working in the 1950s, who was a very well-known writer at that point, who was invited to the Meharry Conference and couldn't attend because of prior considerations. And I'm not sure what sort of effect it may have had on her career, because that conference was it's just the moment when African writing in English is effectively born. Her absence from that conference must have had an effect on her career. The CIA types who are involved in this they're all men. And I suspect that they were better at recruiting men because of the culture at the organization, not just the CIA, but especially at the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Yes.
What was the response of these writers when they determined where that funding was coming from?
Most were outraged. So Nyoji wrote a long piece in Transition when he found out about the scandal of CIA funding, saying, hey, I was duped, I was misused, I didn't know anything about it. And the most surprising thing, he said, is that they never asked me to do anything. They never asked me to change my position. So his reaction is telling for a couple reasons. One, he's outraged because he felt used. The other is he's immediately retreating to defend his integrity as an intellectual, right? I never made any compromises. I never said anything that I didn't fully believe. So that was one of the important lines of defense. Stephen Spender, the British poet that I talked about, who's the editor of Encounter, he worked on Encounter for, about 10 years, and was very involved with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He said he had absolutely no idea, and he was adamant that he was in the dark about CIA funding. And he defended himself along exactly those same lines. He says, hey, I was doing things that I believed in. This was a chance to promote my version of culture, and I never made any kind of political compromises. I never did anything that I didn't feel totally comfortable doing. So there was a huge attempt to shore up the integrity. Wole Soyinka said something interesting years later, which is, he said, I wish we had just known that it was all CIA funded. We could have done so much with that money if the CIA had just been upfront about it. Because what happens is when the cover is blown, that's it. The funding disappears. The CIA steps in and gets the Ford Foundation, I believe, to provide a sort of stopgap funding for the Congress for Cultural Freedom for 2 years. But after those 2 years are up, the funding goes the way of the dinosaur. And that was Soyinka's attitude.
How was the cover blown?
It was blown, and there are some good historians and journalists who've written. I should mention Frances Stoner Saunders wrote a book. It's called Who Paid the Piper in the British version. I can't remember what the US version of the book is called, but it's a long book documenting it. There were some very enterprising investigative journalists working on a magazine called Ramparts, who tracked down several leads. It turned out that, the African stuff was a very small part of the CIA's overall cultural programming. Involved with this program, they infiltrated unions in the US, they infiltrated the National Student Association, and that was one of the biggest scandals, was their infiltration of the NSA. And as I said, it was some investigative journalists who figured this out. Yes?
I was on the faculty at the University of Ife with both Udi Baye and Wole Soyinka.
No
And
kidding.
I find this very interesting because I didn't know anything about this at all. But is there any evidence that the CIA used Soyinka in any way? Because his reputation is very anti-Nigerian.
Anti-totalitarian, right? So, based on what I have seen no evidence that the CIA used Soyinka for anything. Perhaps the only thing that they collected from these writers really was bits and pieces of information, but I don't think the CIA actually did anything with that information, to be honest. they were often used as hosts. So when CIA agents came to Africa under some cover, they would go out for drinks with Bayer or Soyinka, under the cover of being what I would call cultural diplomats. So the CIA often placed people in magazines, and that was their cover. So if Wole Soyinka went out for drinks with a CIA agent when he was touring around Nigeria, Soyinka had absolutely no idea. So there's very little evidence that I have been able to uncover that the CIA used people like Soyinka for operations, let's say. But it's also clear that Soyinka's anti-totalitarian politics fit very comfortably with the CIA's overall objectives.
Here, maybe we have time for one more question.
You pick.
I pick.
Well, there's like 6 hands up. Otherwise, I seem like the bad guy.
So, since
I'll be fast. How about that?
This is quick. I was wondering if, based on your research, you were willing to say that French post-colonial literature and Portuguese post-colonial literature later on remained outside this CIA influence.
So far as I know, yes, largely outside this influence. And it's important that the African operations was really started in 1959, 1960. That's when they got interested in Africa. Interestingly enough, the Congress for Cultural Freedom tried to be really involved in India, and they just never made any headway. The Indian intellectuals were like, this is a CIA front, forget it. We have nothing to do with it. They had much more success. They probably learned some things about their failure in India, and they had much more success in sub-Saharan Africa. But there is no evidence that I have uncovered that they had much influence at all in the Francophone or Lusophone regions. And
I'm just curious to know your opinion as to how sophisticated the CIA's understanding and analysis of what they were doing actually was. I know that there were experiments in East Germany to hire or recruit ordinary factory workers to write literature and so forth.
Yeah.
And the output was always a complete disaster, and no one took it seriously. And so, is there evidence that they learned from the mistakes of their opponents in the Cold War? Did they see modernism as a kind of bulwark against things like Soviet realism?
very much so.
If there's actually sort of white papers or some kind of discussion within the CIA that
Now, a lot of that stuff has not come out into the public domain, so a lot of it is speculation. Part of it is that the U.S. as a whole, and the CIA in particular, certainly saw modernism as a bulwark against communism. And again, the idea that modernism is somehow autonomous, that it's a place that's anti-orthodoxy, and that the people who produce modernism can't be bought off. That is very different than the Soviet cultural diplomacy programs, which I should add, the CIA was trying to emulate. The CIA thought that the US was losing the diplomacy war, especially in the arts. And that's why they came up with this Congress for Cultural Freedom in the first place. So that's the first thing that I would say about that. The second thing is that there was very, very loose oversight at the CIA. Tom Brady and Michael Jocelyn were given a pot of money and given very great latitude about what they wanted to do with it. And as I was talking about this project a little bit with my spouse, she said, I reckon they just like going to cocktail parties with writers. And it's sort of a facetious comment, but it's very true to the culture of the CIA during this period. All these guys, if they're from Europe, are very much educated in the elite cultural tradition. In the US, they're all Dartmouth, Harvard, Yale, Yale especially, and they were absolutely fascinated with the world of high culture. And they did everything that they could to attach themselves to it and to patronize it. So there are, I would argue, at least a couple reasons why they were interested in modernism. Abstract expressionism becomes, in painting, becomes the de facto advertisement for the US protecting modernism, right? And the bonus is it's produced by US artists first and foremost, right? So Europe after World War II is exhausted. They have no business preserving and promoting modernism. So, we'll we'll take over that responsibility here in the U.S. And abstract expressionism. George Kennan, who's involved in writing the policy of containment. I believe he was on the board of the Museum of Modern Art, and he was very involved there in promoting abstract expressionism in the 1950s. This was seen as a crucial part of Cold War policy.
Thank you, Peter. You brought us a wonderful presentation, and there's lots more questions.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.